This is St. John Chrysostom. We have his icon in the church here, and here's a little copy of it. St. John Chrysostom. That wasn't his actual given name, Chrysostom. His name was John. Chrysostom is Greek for golden mouth. And people gave him that name later after he was dead because they remembered that he'd been such a wonderful preacher that it was like his words were made of gold coming out of his mouth. So he's called John Chrysostom now. He was born in the great city of Antioch, which is now a sort of a small ruined city in southern Turkey. He wasn't raised exactly as a Christian. He was given a very good education. And when he was about 20, he became a Christian. He was baptized and went out into the mountains near Antioch to live with monks and hermits for several years. He spent most of his 20s out there, and then his health kind of failed. He got various illnesses. So he came back into the city where he could be treated. The bishop saw that he was a very devout and holy man, and so made him a deacon. This was when John was about 36. He became Deacon John. And he began doing a lot of preaching in the churches of the city. And everybody for hundreds of miles around thought he was the greatest preacher they'd ever heard. Many pagans were converted to the church by listening to his preaching. He was very popular. Well, one day they were having an ordination and making new priests. And a lot of the people said, "Oh, let's make Deacon John a priest." Well, he heard about this, so he went and hid. He hid down in the basement among all the old clothes that were out of style and the broken furniture and all that stuff. But they hunted all over the house and they finally found him and they took him to the church and he was ordained a priest. He wasn't happy about that at first, but he was about 40 when that happened. Well, as soon as that happened, he started getting more and more work piled on him, more sermons to preach. He would preach 2 or 3 times every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times in a day. Antioch was a big city, and he was the main preacher for the whole city. The bishop was old, and he couldn't talk loudly anymore. And in a church with a couple of thousand people there, he couldn't make himself heard. So he always had Father John preach his sermons for him. Yes?
I just want to make an observation. It seems that a lot of saints, plus a lot of most of the churches I've been to, there's always been like a deacon or a father, maybe their name is John or John.
It's a very common name, you're right. Christians have used the name John a lot for all the centuries of the church. Yes, we have 2 clergymen named John right here. So after Father John had been a priest for about 10 years. A few hundred miles away, the Archbishop of Constantinople died. This was a big, important office. And the emperor said, "Well, I've heard about this great preacher down in Antioch. Let's have him come up here and make him Archbishop of Constantinople." Well, they knew they weren't going to be able to talk him into coming, so they essentially kidnapped him. And several soldiers took him to Constantinople. He was ordained, consecrated archbishop there, and he went on preaching. Well, Constantinople was a great big city full of rich people, and it was a kind of a worldly city. The government was there. It was one of the 2 capitals of the Roman Empire. And so Bishop John found plenty of things to preach about. He kept telling the rich people, "Hey, shame on you. Look at the back of the church. There's hundreds of poor people back there. They don't have enough clothing. They're hungry. And you sit up here and you spend tons of money on your clothes and on fancy houses and feasts. Shame on you." Suppose they liked that? No, they didn't like that. Then one year, there was people in Constantinople were sports fans, okay? They loved athletic games and horse races. One year, there was a big giant horse race scheduled on Good Friday, and lots of people didn't go to church. Instead, they went to the horse race and cheered for their team. The bishop had serious words to say about that on Easter morning. He bawled them out, no end. He wasn't making friends among the rich people, but the poor people liked him. And then he preached one sermon that was especially about how women were spending way too much money fixing their hair and all like that. And the empress, whose name was Eudoxia, thought he was talking about her in particular. Maybe he was. So she said, okay, this has to end. We've got to get rid of him. And she got her husband, the emperor, to say, all right, we're going to find a new archbishop. Archbishop John has to leave. We're sending him off into exile. And they sent him a long way away to the other end of the Black Sea. You can look at a map, to a little town in the mountains where he was exiled. Well, then they decided to send him even further. And he was an old man by this time. He was about 60, and his health was failing. And they sent a couple of very rough soldiers to take him on further. They made him ride in hot weather, and then when it was raining constantly, they made him walk along the road in the rain. He got very sick, and it became very clear he was about to die. So they took him to a village, and the priests and deacons in the village were around him when he died. His last words were, "Glory be to God for all things." So, Bishop John his body was taken back to Constantinople, and then various other places. It got stolen and taken to Rome at one time, but then just a few years ago, 13 years ago, the Pope at Rome gave the body of John Chrysostom back to the church in Constantinople. So if you ever happen to be in Constantinople, go to St. George's Cathedral, and that's where his tomb is now. Well, here we are. It's been 1,600 years after St. John died, and he's still one of the best known, best loved saints in the whole church. He wrote many books, and he preached hundreds of sermons, and he was just a very holy, good bishop. So we have his pictures hanging in our churches, and many of our churches are named Church of St. John Chrysostom. And so I thought you ought to know a little about who he is and why we love him. Yes?
That also might be why his name is so popular.
I'm sure that adds to it. Yet another great St. John. Okay, that's your lesson. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Amen.